going to be an XUnit test project, and I will call this Evently Modules Users because we are targeting the users module, and let's call it architecture tests. Let me create the test project. I'm going to remove the default test file this time, and let me add the necessary NuGet packages. So I'm going to look for Fluent Assertions, same as before. I'm going to install the latest version. Let's go ahead and add netarchtest.rules and also install the latest version. And I'm going to update the NuGet packages that are scaffolded in a default XUnit test project. So with all of our NuGet packages up to date, let's see how we're going to write the architecture tests for one module. And in order to save us some time and so that we can focus on what matters, which is the actual implementation details, I'm going to add all of the code required to implement the architecture test for the users module. If you want to add this right now, you will be able to find the complete users module architecture test projects right under this video. And let's examine what we have inside of our users module architecture test project. I will start from the abstractions. So I created the same helper method so that I can easily verify the test result from netarch test rules. This should probably be part of a common test project for architecture testing, but it's not too much trouble if we duplicate this across our tests. Then we have a base test class, and inside of it I am defining the individual assemblies that I have for one module. So I have the application assembly, the domain assembly, the infrastructure assembly, and the presentation assembly. Of course, this makes sense given that I'm implementing the clean architecture. So if you are doing something different, you will have to adapt this approach. And then let's take a look at the individual test for my clean architecture layers. In the domain test class, we're using a similar approach as before, only this time I'm enforcing some design rules. For example, domain events should be sealed, or domain events should have a domain event postfix. So this is a sort of naming convention that I want to enforce for domain events inside of my assemblies. We also have another test here, checking that entities should have a private parameterless constructor. This is useful for EF Core. And I also have another test checking that entities should only have private constructors. This is an interesting design rule and is definitely not something that you have to implement. I did this because I only want to allow creating my entity types using static factory methods. So in this case, a test like this makes sense, but be free to adapt these tests to the design rules that you want to enforce. In the application layer, you will see a similar set of tests. For example, this is requiring that command types should be sealed and that they are following a given naming convention. We have a similar approach for command handlers. Then I can write the same set of rules for queries and the respective query handlers, as well as the command validators, which I want to be internal to a given module, sealed types, and also have a name ending with validator. So netarch test really makes writing design rules like these very simple. All you have to do is select a given type, filter by these types. In this case, we are looking for any types that implement a domain event handler. And then we can say that they should have a name ending with a given value, or that they should be sealed types, or that these types should not be public. In the presentation layer, I also have a similar set of tests for my integration event consumers. So I'm looking for types that implement the iConsumer interface from mass transit. In one of the next lessons, I'm going to introduce the integration event handler type. So I'm going to be slightly updating these test cases, but I'm going to notify you when this happens. And we also have a layer test project, which is the one checking the direction of dependencies between the layers in our clean architecture module. So in this case, the domain layer should not have a dependency on the application layer. The domain layer should also not have a dependency on the infrastructure layer. The application layer should not have a dependency on infrastructure. The application layer should not have a dependency on presentation. And the presentation layer should not have a dependency on infrastructure. Come to think of it, we can also introduce a check that domain should not reference presentation, but this is probably overkill for our use case. All in all, we have 20-something architecture tests, 27 to be precise. So I'm going to execute all of the tests for the users module, and you can see that all of our tests are passing. Now let me try to break one of these tests just to show you that they are actually working. And I will go to the user entity and, for example, remove the private constructor. And remember that I'm enforcing my entity implementations to both have a private parameterless constructor and all of their constructors should be private. What would be another rule that we can break? Let's take a look at the user registered domain event. And for example, let's remove the sealed keyword. And now if I rerun my architecture test for the users module, you will see that we have a few tests failing. So in this case, you can see that we got 2 failing tests. Both are referencing to the entities and the constructor design rules. So let me go ahead and fix those. What's interesting is that the test targeting my domain events did not fail. And this is because I added a design rule that looks for types that implement an interface. And because my type inherits from the domain event base class, I can slightly update this test to say if a type inherits the domain event base class, then it should be sealed. Now if I rerun this test, I'm expecting it to fail, and you can see that this is the case. So let's go ahead and fix our test case, and let's also fix the user by introducing back the private parameterless constructor, and let's rerun all of the tests for our domain layer. And you can see that all of our domain tests are passing, as well as all of the architecture tests that we defined in the solution. At this point, what you can do is introduce the architecture tests for all of the modules in your system, which I'm going to do behind the scenes, and starting from the next lesson, we will be enforcing our software architecture and design rules for all of our modules using architecture tests. And this brings us to the end of our architecture testing lesson, as well as the current chapter about architecture enforcement. In this chapter, we discussed some strategies that we can use to enforce the modular architecture, such as using the compiler and the tools that we have in place in C# to enforce a modular architecture. We can also use some third-party tools like SonarQube, NDepend, and even a NuGet package like NSDepCop to enforce our namespace dependencies and other design rules. And lastly, I showed you how to implement a bunch of architecture tests that help you ensure that you have the correct direction of dependencies in place between your modules and also between the individual projects inside of one module. In the next chapter, we will talk about implementing reliable messaging between our modules, and we are going to introduce 2 patterns that are going to help us solve this, the outbox and the inbox pattern.